morning. Good morning. If you do not have an outline there in the back in the bulletin, unless you get the last one, because the last one does not have an outline. I didn't do the math correctly, I guess, and so hopefully you don't get the last one. Get there before everyone else and grab it. But anyway, get your outline out. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 1. We've been talking about coincidences a bit now, talking about the grace of God and how God's plan works regardless of man's involvement, whether it is for or against. And it is too often we find ourselves in one of those two capacities. We would like to be for His will more often than not, but too often we find we get in the way. We find our desires and our will gets in the way of God's will. And we need to work on that as a group of people, in general, as humanity. But intrinsically or individually, we need to work on that. But understanding that coincidence is an interesting thing, and we try to find it wherever we can. And I've probably shared this before. I talk a lot about Arby's, probably because I dealt with so many people. And I don't talk a lot about 80/20, which was one of my other major jobs that I had before becoming a preacher. Probably because I was really isolated in that job. It was more like an individual job, and I didn't have a lot of exposure, especially to the public. And anytime you get exposure to the public, it's both a blessing and a curse. A blessing for preachers because it gives you a lot of things you can talk about. But I probably talked about it before, this desire that people have, or the interest they have when something turns out to be an exact amount, like $14. When it rounds, or you end in double zeros. People really like that. They think it's really intriguing, and oftentimes they say, man, what are the odds? And this little part of me always says, 1 in 100. 1 in 100. In fact, we had that at McDonald's the other day. It just happened to turn, I don't know, like $7 or something. And they were like, wow, that's really great. What are the odds? And my wife just looked at me and laughed. 1 in 100. It's helpful happenstance. I mean, it's nice when that happens, especially if you're using a debit card and you're going to inevitably record it, because that's a lot easier math to do than change. But that's not terribly important or odd. It happens fairly regularly, in fact, if you think about it. Last Sunday, I believe it was, we talked about at the very beginning, the fifth Sunday falling on the Sunday being the last day of the year, and we have the New Year's Eve party. There we go. And it just kind of was nice because we got to come here and we sang songs and we shared, and then we transitioned into a game night, which was great. And sometimes you're like, well, what are the odds? 1 in 7, right? Because there's 7 days in a week. It could have fallen on any of them. But primarily, we see that, and we see things sometimes happening coincidental that aren't coincidental, and sometimes we think things are going on that really aren't. Now, if you were to go to the bank and ask, this would be a weird question to ask for some random amount of money from the bank, from your withdrawal from your account, and then go to the store, and if that happened to be the exact same amount of money that the bank happened to give you, that would be pretty impressive. That would be something. But that doesn't happen terribly often in our human life, so we try to associate a lot of things into this coincidental or something really important is happening, perhaps. But when we look at the Bible, I am floored at the number of times that we would easily and consistently desire to chalk something up to coincidence. It's really interesting happenstance. It's helpful that took place. Like when Joseph just happened to be in Egypt at the time that the Israelites, his family, was going through a famine. And he happened to be in a position to help his family out, and in fact give them a place to stay for approximately 300 to 400 years while they were going through that famine that happened to be in the land at the time that God wanted them, and in fact told their ancestor Abraham that He was going to send them into the land of other individuals. Coincidence? No, it's not coincidence at all. The wise men, and we talked about last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, bringing gold and myrrh and frankincense right before the angel comes to Joseph and says, hey guys, guess what? Got to go to Egypt. And what does this family need right now? Money. And all three of those, gold, in fact, particularly, but frankincense and myrrh, were practically money. Were practically valuable enough to just be spent. The timing of Jesus, especially from the book of Daniel, if you studied it recently, that at the time of these kings, God will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. That's pretty pretty incredible. That God knew, and we would say all the way back in Daniel, way further back than that, but we can establish it in situations like that. That God knew what was taking place and what was transpiring, as well as being able to affect what was happening. And you add to that, say, Esther. Who knows, but for such a time as this, that you have come into this position, Esther being the queen of the Persians, and able to save the people of Israel because of this great travesty that was being brought upon them. And Mordecai was right. That we see these things and we're tempted to just say, wow, what a coincidence, or what a funny happenstance that these would work out this way. But Romans 8 says that the things work out. Things work out the way they need to in order for God's will to be accomplished. And that's really the essence of Matthew. The book of Matthew is, in a lot of ways, you might say, the world would say, a book of coincidences. That's what they would call it, because they don't understand the providence of God, or the will of God, His ability to do and to work to His good pleasure and to our best interest, frankly. So when we talk about the book of Matthew, we have to talk about a man, yes, that we call him Matthew, and that was his name, but he was also called Levi. And we know from our texts of the Gospels specifically that he was a tax collector, which, along with a fisherman, was not the most popular of jobs. Was not the job that necessarily everybody wanted. But he was an honest man. An honest tax collector. Seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it? But it wasn't. And so he was called by Jesus to follow him. He was called explicitly out of his life and to follow Jesus. And he became Jesus' disciple and one of the apostles. And as such, he was privy to some of the most amazing things. He was witness to some of the most amazing events. And he took that, and he not only wrote it down by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but in Matthew chapter 5, notice in verse 17, Jesus' words. Notice why. One of the reasons why Jesus came. And we could debate which is the most important reason Jesus came, because there's a lot of reasons that Jesus came to the earth. And I think all of them would have a valid case for being the most important. But in verse 7 he says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass away from the law till all is fulfilled." One jot or tittle was in the Hebrew alphabet. It was a iota, and that might be one of your translations. Might include the iota. The jot or tittle comes from an English concept of this Jewish concept. And the jot or the tittle is the crossing of the T or the dotting of the I. In the Hebrew, it would have been these very small subscripts, basically the I or the crossing of the T in the Hebrew alphabet, essentially. And Jesus says that nothing is going to be destroyed. It was never my intention to destroy. It was my intention to fulfill. And so he comes on the scene, and what does Matthew do? He records every time that Jesus fulfills something. And it's interesting that this be the case, because Jesus came, he says, Matthew's focus is how Christ fulfills prophecy, and particularly the promise. The promise is a very big idea, so we'll break it down in just a moment, but how he fulfills prophecy, not only the prophecies throughout the Old Testament, but he fulfills the promise that God gave to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15, that through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed, through his seed. And so we find this book of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew. It's not the Gospel of Matthew, though that would be a pretty great story too. Going from a tax collector to an apostle, that's a pretty excellent story. But he had a more important thing to record. That would be the life and times of Jesus Christ. And then again, his focus is on how Christ fulfills the prophecy and the promise. And so we have this focus being here. So the Jewish Christians, the Christians altogether, this is believed to be one of the most read books in the early Christian times. As soon as the book was recorded, that is to say, written down and shared and copied and copied and copied by hand, I might say, then it was brought to various congregations and they would read it aloud. And there were a few books that became very popular. John, obviously, for really great reasons. I love the book of John. and Matthew. And one of the reasons was because of the situation of the people at the time having to deal with this crossover, understand what's transpiring, just as you see the individuals in the first century. Just as you see these individuals not understanding the full weight and the gamut of transitioning from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And you find Christians who are struggling with that, even into Acts 14 and 15. The reason the Jerusalem Council took place was because there were individuals, Jewish Christians in various parts of the world, who thought the Old Testament in part or in whole was still valid, was still useful, they were still responsible for it. And so they pressured the Gentiles, in this case, to become Jews before they could become Christians. And so circumcision became an issue. And Paul fights against it so strongly that they end up getting very aggressive, and Paul finally just says, hey guys, let's just go back to Jerusalem and talk to the apostles. And they, hey, that's a great idea. Let's do that. So they have a contingent. The Jerusalem Council happens there in Acts 15. And so this transitional period and this transition that's taking place was difficult for a lot of people to understand, even to such a degree that Paul would call it the mystery. The mystery. And there's a lot of mysteries that take place. How God was going to rejoin the Jews and the Gentiles. How He was going to deal with sin once and for all in a final way. How God was going to restore man back to a position where he once held, like in the garden. And how this whole issue of sin was going to be resolved. And so the placement of the book of Matthew makes a lot of sense. Here at the opening of the New Testament, this transition period between Malachi and the Gospels. And it makes sense that he would be the first, considering passages like Matthew chapter 1. In verse 22, notice he says, so all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, in this case, the virgin birth. In chapter 2 and verse 15, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. In verse 17, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet. Then in verse 23, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, he shall be called a Nazarene. And if you can keep going, chapter 4, verse 14, chapter 8, verse 17, chapter 12, verse 17, chapter 13, verse 35, chapter 21, verse 4, chapter 27, verse 9, and verse 35. If you'd like the list, you can ask me afterward. I'd be happy to give it to you, but it basically says the same thing in each of these passages. Now, why? Why does Matthew focus on this? Because it's so important. Matthew's focus is on Jesus being the Messiah, the promised one, the one that they should have been anticipating and they should have been listening to and waiting for, the one that Moses had talked about, the prophet like unto me, like unto Moses, that would come, and you should hear his words and you should obey his commands. And so there's a very strong connection to the Old Testament, not just in these explicit cases, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12 or so explicit cases where he says, by the way, this is exactly what was talked about. But also in a more generic way, in a more general way, or a less explicit way, where he implies things, where we talk about, he makes connections to things that were going on. And each of the gospel writers does an amazing job at what they're focused on. But not all of them are focused on Jesus being the Messiah. In fact, one of them is focused on Jesus being the King, and so it focuses on those elements. And one of them is focused on Jesus as a human, that would be John. And so it focuses on those elements. And you see it throughout the writing that his purpose is solidly one thing. Though he will talk about a lot of things, he comes back to the same point. And he takes special attention of those moments, of those points. And the Holy Spirit gives him the way to record those things. We see here in number one, the second number one, I guess. I don't understand numbers, I suppose. Whatever. So number one, number two, you got to notice that it opens with key figures. If we go back to Matthew chapter 1, we're going to go ahead and read. This doesn't happen a lot, I don't think. And if I'd known that Chase was going to be the scripture reader, I would have just gone ahead and gone with Matthew 1 through 17, and I'd have sat there and enjoyed myself. He probably would have done a bang-up job. The trick is just to say it as if you know what you're talking about. And people don't question, because nobody knows how it's supposed to be said. It's okay. And that's what I'm going to do. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now when you hear that, genealogy of Jesus, you go, what is he reading? It's important. And if this theory, believed to be the most read aloud New Testament book to early Christians, if this is true, that means this passage was read a lot and was a really important passage. And as we read it, I think you're going to realize, maybe not at first, but over time, you're going to realize how really important this is. He says in verse 2, Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar, but only one of them is the ancestor of Jesus. That would be Perez in this case. Twins, Perez and Zerah, which is interesting because that would be the second time in 2 generations that there were twins born to this family. I found that interesting. And because I was reading and going, wow, I remember something else happening like that. Is this the one? No, it's not the story. The story is the previous generation with Jacob and Esau. But it happens again, which I thought was cool. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her, and it includes who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon begot Rehoboam. Rehoboam begot Abijah, and Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat begot Joram, and Joram begot Uzziah. Uzziah begot Jotham. Jotham begot Ahaz, and Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Manasseh begot Ammon, and Ammon begot Josiah. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. And after they were brought to Babylon, here comes the hardness. Jeconiah begot Shealtiel, and Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel begot Abiad. Abiad begot Eliakim, and Eliakim begot Azor. Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim, and Achim begot Eliad. Eliad begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Mathan, and Mathan begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David unto the captivities in Babylon were 14 generations, and from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. 14, 14, 14. Makes it easier for people to memorize. And a lot of individuals have done exactly that. Memorize the lineage of Jesus Christ. Now this is not a common thing anymore, not in America anyway, because in America, our ancestry, outside of a few random individuals, we don't consider terribly important. Not in the strictest sense, not in the way they did anyway. They considered it of such importance that many of the children would learn their heritage, their generational pattern, all the way back to Abraham if they could track it that far. And all the Jews in Jesus' day could. Now there would be something that would happen about 40 years later that would keep that from being the case any longer. That would be the records that were kept in the temple would be destroyed, which is probably more important than the temple being destroyed, in all honesty. We focus on the temple being destroyed because that's incredible. That's impressive that God would allow the temple to be destroyed. But more impressive, in my opinion, is the fact that these records would be destroyed, because the temple's been destroyed before. You know what hasn't been destroyed before? These records. They were kept, and they were maintained. And it's never told who maintained them, because when the Babylonians came in and destroyed the temple, did they take the records with them? I mean, they took the rest of the vestments and everything that was in it, all the articles of gold and all the things that were in the temple, they took with them, and Nebuchadnezzar was smart enough, wise enough to house until the day that he wouldn't need him anymore. Unfortunately, his grandson would not be so wise, and he would bring some of them out, and he would praise and worship the gods of wood and iron and stone and clay with them, and that would be the end of the Babylonians, because God's wrath would come upon them through the Medes and the Persians. But you know what? All this gold coincidentally never got destroyed, never got melted down, because it needed to go back in the temple. God knew that it was only on loan to the Babylonians and then to the Medes for a few years. and then it would be restored. And so the Babylonians didn't melt it down. They didn't make coinage out of it. They didn't use it for various purposes. And the Jews didn't have to go on some special journey in order to find it. Because when it was time for them to return, when Cyrus the Great let them go, as the God of heaven and earth had instructed he would, and when Daniel brings it to his mind that it was time, Cyrus lets them go, and doesn't just let them go as they are. He gives them back the articles of the temple. Why in the world would he do that? What a coincidence. That's exactly what they would need to reestablish worship in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament. And yet, he did it. He gave it right back to them because it was God's plan that that happened. Notice with me a few key things here. The genealogy of Jesus, it begins with what would be considered the most important two individuals in Jesus' lineage. And one of them was the most important, and that is to say, Abraham. Abraham is always going to be the most important individual in any Jew's lineage. As long as they can trace their lineage back to Abraham, that means that they are an Israelite in the strictest sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're a faithful Israelite, but that is another story entirely. Abraham was the father of the Jews. He is the origin of the promise, as we talked about earlier, this important promise that would not be fulfilled until the days of Jesus. Something so important in Galatians chapter 3, Paul would argue with the Christians at the time. Not necessarily argue, but instruct them concerning this thing. In Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 15, notice with me, he says, "Brethren, I speak in the manner of men, though it is only a man's covenant. Yet if it is confirmed, no one annuls or adds to it. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds, as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ." Basically, Paul argues from the singularity of the word seed to say it's not the Jews that he is talking about, and he is right. That Jesus is the seed of Abraham, through whom would come all the blessings unto the nations of the world. And this I say, he says, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ, that it should make the promise of no effect. For if the inheritance is of the law, it is no longer a promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. And we are partakers in that promise, Paul would argue. Not only those Christians there in that day, and not only the Jewish Christians that he would not only be talking to, but also Gentile Christians. But he's speaking not only to them, but to us. We are partakers of this promise. So when we go back into the book of Genesis and we read about Abraham, and we read this instance of where God had Abraham split the animals in half, and God was going to make a covenant with Abraham, and he's talking about all the blessings that would come, that some of them are to Abraham's immediate descendants. That God would bless them, he would protect them, because they would be the vehicle by which he would bring the Messiah. And through that Messiah, through that Christ, through this Jesus, that he would bring redemption. He would bring opportunity to change to all of us. The opportunity to be redeemed from our sins. And Paul argues that, not only in this case, but in a number of cases. I imagine this was one of the primary arguments that he would make when he would go into a new area. He would immediately go into the synagogue, if there was one. He would find the Jews in the area, because there was already a baseline, and he would begin discussing with them. Begin talking with them about this Jesus, and he would argue, I imagine, from these particular points, and more, probably. But this was one of the major points he would argue, I imagine. And the information that he's given. Now, the second individual would be important for some of the Israelites. Now, all the Israelites would think this guy was important, but not all of them could trace their lineage back to him as they could to Abraham. And that was one thing all the Israelites shared. They could trace their name or their line back to Abraham. But in a different sense, some of those Israelites were able to trace their name or their lineage back to David. In Genesis chapter 49, God bestows the kingship over Israel on Judah. He gives it to Judah for a number of reasons, even though Judah is not the oldest of his children. In fact, there are 3 older children than Judah: Reuben, Levi, and his brother Simeon. There we go. It came back to me. And yet each of them was passed over for a particular reason, which we won't go into right here, but it fell to Judah. And Judah becomes the one who would hold the line until Shiloh would come, the one to whom it belonged. The scepter would be in Judah's hands until Shiloh would come, and then he would take it, and no one else would. No one else would take it again. No one else would need to take it again, because he would control that scepter forever and ever. And so we find that David is in not only Jesus' lineage, but he is the descendant, or he is the direct descendant of the line of the kings. That is to say, because you couldn't just stop at David. There were a lot of people who could trace their lineage back to David, but what if their lineage didn't go through Samuel, or through Solomon, through Rehoboam, right, and through the immediate lineage of the kings? It wasn't enough to just trace your line back all the way to David, or to trace your line all the way back to Abraham. If you wanted to be king of Israel, if you wanted to at least stand a chance of being king of Israel, you had to be able to trace it all the way back through the particular line of David's immediate son, Solomon, and then Rehoboam, and on through the kingly line specifically, because each of those individuals had multiple children. And it wasn't enough to be any of those children either. And so David, or Matthew here, he establishes that Jesus is in the line of succession. And you know, it's really crazy now. We just talked about the temple was destroyed, and with it all the records, which means that Jesus is the only Jew alive today who is able to trace their lineage back to David, to prove unequivocally that they are able to bear and hold the position of the king of Israel. He's the only one alive today, because all those records were destroyed, and yet this has been preserved. Preserved because the Christian saw it as important, because it is part of our understanding of God and His will, and because Matthew, through inspiration of the Holy Spirit, designed that it would be the case. It's also intriguing, and I wonder if it's not happenstance, of course. I'm talking about coincidence here, of course. But it's also interesting that the same line back 4 or 5 generations is also the line, or Luke, I should say, in Luke 3, traces the line back through Mary. Here he traces it through Joseph, which is the legal line. Mary traces back also through David, which I find interesting. So regardless of what argument you make, Jesus is legitimately ruler. He is the one to whom it belongs, and he is the only one who can prove. Now, if you were to read through it again, which I will not do right now, whenever you read through it, especially in a public setting, you will read it. I hope you, if you have opportunity to read something like this, genealogies in a public setting, take the opportunity to read it a few times ahead of time. But I'll tell you, no matter how many times you read it ahead of time, you're going to wish you had read it a few more times ahead of time. But what you will notice, if you were to read it again, and I encourage you to, certainly, you're going to notice that there are 4 women. Technically 5, if you include Mary. But there are 4 women. Those are unconventional inclusions. And each of them demonstrates grace in a particular way. Unconventional inclusions because most lineages, and if you pass all the way back to the Chronicles, for instance, and you were to read through those, they do not house women primarily. There are very few women, in fact, listed among the Chronicles. And if you were to read in Jewish historical accounts and Jewish genealogies, you would not find women in them. And that is not to discredit women, but the line passed through men. And yet you have Tamar. Tamar in Genesis 38, who played the harlot. And I say played because she literally acted like a harlot in order to be inseminated by her father-in-law, which is a terrible story. But I think we give Tamar a bad rap, because 2 women at that time bearing children to their husband, who, if you remember the story, is now dead, and then his brothers die in succession because they refuse to give that heir to their brother, which is their responsibility. Tamar is left in this really peculiar situation where Judah is not giving her father-in-law is not giving her his next son to procure an heir for her first husband, which is her responsibility and his, to be honest. And so she, in my mind, in a lot of ways, like Jacob, again, we give Jacob a hard time because Jacob basically pretends he plays Esau, doesn't he? But why does he play Esau? Why does he pretend to be Esau? Because Esau had already sold his birthright. And guess what? Isaac doesn't know it. Why doesn't Isaac know that Esau has already sold his birthright? Because Esau should have told him. Jacob or Isaac should know. And yet, he doesn't. Isaac doesn't know that this birthright belongs to Jacob. And so Jacob must pretend to be Esau in order to receive what is his. In a similar situation, I liken Tamar, who played the harlot, yes, who did something that was considered unacceptable at the time, but it was to procure what was her due, what was her responsibility, what she was supposed to be accomplishing, and Judah was keeping her from it. Now, you might disagree with her methods and her motive, but Rahab, can you imagine including Rahab in your genealogy? Like, if you had a Rahab in your genealogy, would you list her? Like, the male version, you kind of have to, because you're supposed to list the males. So there are technically 3 males, those relating to Athaliah, who is an awful queen and a wicked person, who are not included. That's interesting as well. But of all the individuals that I would have to include, Rahab is not one I have to include, and yet she's thrown in there. Why? Because of the transition that she makes. And because of who she was, a Gentile in the city of Jericho, who became an Israelite, a child of God in that covenant, because of her faithfulness, because of her willingness to go against, there in Joshua chapter 2, her people, and to become part of the people of God. That is amazing, an amazing story. Ruth is the next one, which is also interesting because if you read it again, you'll find that Rahab is the mother-in-law of Ruth. So why is Boaz so open when his ancestor, or when his cousin is not open to marrying Ruth? Probably because Rahab's his mom. And he sees no issue, or he recognizes how important it is to be open-minded when you can be. And so Boaz marries a Moabitess, and that Moabitess brings forth a child. And then the woman whose name is not listed, and yet she is immediately there. She's actually called to from implication. Bathsheba is her name, and she is the partner in David's infidelity in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And she again gets a bad rap. And was it okay for them to be involved in this? Obviously not, and there were consequences to their actions. But as we've discussed before, there is a conclusion to this story, and it is a great conclusion. Bathsheba is an excellent individual following this sin. And how much was her involvement, and how much was it the key